All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Twyla. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to pass it over to Liz to kick things off.
Thanks, Twyla. Welcome to today's webinar, Resilience Hubs, a Blueprint for Climate Adaptation. My name is Liz Corrigan, and I lead project management efforts for community-scale renewable energy initiatives at Stantec. Today's program is brought to you by the Illinois Green Alliance Programs Committee, a volunteer group that leads the selection, development, and implementation of Illinois Green's education events. The team that organized today's event included Jessica Haberstock and myself. Everyone has been muted upon entry. We will have a question and answer session at the end of this program, so feel free to type your questions into the Q&A chat and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Illinois Green Alliance is a membership-driven nonprofit that advances sustainability in the built environment to ensure greener and healthier communities across the state. Their 2050 vision is to make net zero buildings feasible, affordable, and so commonplace that every building in the state is net zero by 2050. They accomplish this work through three key pillars: educating building industry professionals through webinars, panels, and tours, advancing policy to scale energy efficiency and net zero adoption, and demonstrating that high-performance buildings can work anywhere. Their members represent every sector in the building industry, from architects and engineers to building owners and construction professionals. You can learn more about membership, check out upcoming events, and learn how to get involved by visiting their website. The link will be in the chat. This webinar is approved through AIA for 1 LUHSW credit and can be logged for 1 LEED AP or Green Associate Continuing Education hour. Certificates of completion for both AIA members and non-AIA members are available upon request. To request an AIA continuing education credit or a personalized certificate of completion for architecture license continuing education reporting purposes, you can use this QR code on the screen and complete the linked form. I'll also be linking the form in the chat and at the end of our session. For those who are interested in self-reporting their continuing education hours for your LEED AP or LEED Green Associate credentials, we'll be sharing self-reporting instructions and a fillable certificate of completion in our follow-up email to all attendees next week. Here are today's AIA learning objectives. I'm not going to read all of these for you, but overall, the reason we are here today is to learn about infrastructure that's supporting communities to be more resilient, increase social connection, and encourage economic strength in traditionally underserved communities. And one final thing before we get started is we want to thank Illinois Green's sustaining sponsors who make all of this work possible. A special thank you to our gold level sponsors, ComEd, USGBC, and Sloan. Without further ado, let's get started with today's program. I'd like to introduce you to our fantastic set of speakers. Victoria is a seasoned mechanical engineer known for her innovative approach to HVAC design, project management, business development within the built environment. Her expertise spans a wide range of responsibilities, including heating and cooling load calculations, ductwork design, distribution, and equipment sizing. Victoria excels in collaboration with interdisciplinary teams, thoroughly assessing on-site conditions of existing buildings and addressing RFIs, design challenges, and feedback from owners, architects, and contractors. Alina's career trajectory exemplifies a deep commitment to building a resilient and sustainable world through her roles in architecture and business ownership. She leads by example, holding sustainability certifications, including WELL AP and LFA, working with architecture clients to realize socially and environmentally responsible and responsive buildings at various scales, including affordable housing, cultural, higher education, and commercial buildings. Her personal mission of building a better world is reflected in her career choices and volunteer work. She continuously takes actionable steps towards a more sustainable future. Just as a reminder, we will have the Q&A at the end of this program, so feel free to add any questions into the chat so our speakers will address them at the end of their presentations. And with that, I will pass things off to Victoria and Alina. All
Thank you
right,
so
looks
much,
like we have
Liz.
your slides. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liz. Victoria and I are really excited to be here today presenting to the Illinois Green Alliance community. So we'll start with a few definitions, and you might hear me ask Vicky to advance slides as we go. So, let's see. So we'll start with a few definitions. I want to make sure we're all on the same page about key terms and concepts as we go into today. So we'll start with climate resilience planning, which generates the capacity to survive and adapt and thrive. So it focuses on preparing a municipality, a community, building to withstand and recover from shocks, stressors, and disruptions by proactively identifying potential risks, developing mitigation strategies, and fostering adaptability. Next slide, please, Vicky. So where is resilience planning required? Pretty much everywhere. This map illustrates the level of vulnerability that communities across the US face. And these are public resources, so we definitely recommend looking into them. So again, this is overall climate vulnerability. The darker color generally represents a more at-risk area. Next slide, please. The next map shows just the climate impacts, including temperature-related health issues, the cost of climate disasters, and likelihood of facing climate disasters or extreme events. Next slide, please. This map takes into account the community-related impacts, including socioeconomic risks and general level of economic stability in a community. So things like risk of exposure to air pollution, rates of disease, or level of investment in a community, or rather, the darker the color, we're looking at disinvestment. Next map, or next slide, please. So these are the specific categories that we just saw in graphic form. The left side is what we saw on the pink map, and the right side is what we saw on the orange map. So you can get really granular with this data and really helps to inform design, particularly in disadvantaged communities. So we'll take that into account as we move forward. I'll hand it off to Vicky for a couple more intro slides.
So hi everyone. So the question now that we're going to ask ourselves is, what exactly is climate justice, right? So climate justice is a movement and a framework that addresses the unequal impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, right? And it seeks to ensure a fair and equitable distribution of both the burdens of climate change and the efforts to mitigate it, right? So if we bring this all together to this presentation that we're having, Alina and I will be discussing the importance of implementing resilience hubs. So by definition, uh, as you can see on the screen, this is the definition of a resilience hub, but then a resilience hub is basically a go-to spot in the community where people can find support and resources, whether there's a major emergency like a natural disaster or just an emergency in their everyday life. So think of it as a welcoming place to get useful information, essential supplies or services you might need. And it's often set up in places you're already familiar with, like your local libraries, schools, and your community centers. So,
We'll into the first case study here. Thank you, Vicki. So we'll start with the Hope Center, which is a nonprofit operating out of Roanoke, Virginia. Next slide, please. Oh, and sorry, we'll give you a quick overview on the map. So we're talking about Roanoke, Virginia, Detroit, Michigan, and Racine, Wisconsin today. So focused on the Midwest and related region. So the Hope Center. Next slide, please. So the Hope Center is a nonprofit operating out of Roanoke, Virginia's disadvantaged northwest side. It was hit really hard by urban renewal projects, which basically raised a lot of that area of the city with the promise of recreating housing, which never occurred. So there's a lot of distrust in government, meaning in this case, a library or school may not be as trustworthy as a local nonprofit such as the Hope Center. So this makes it perfect. The foundation is already there. They're already serving the community. And the question for our technical assistance team was really, how can we amplify what you're already doing? And how could we leverage funds to really enable you to do what you do that much more, that much better? So next slide, please. We dug into the data for the area first. looking at the same maps that you just saw. So looking at what are the vulnerabilities here? So we're looking at a lot of air pollution, extreme heat, and flooding. So that informs the design in the sense that, we're probably not going to have a basement that might, be prone to flooding. We're going to pay a lot of attention to quality and the mechanical system to make sure that we're able to provide healthy air. So things like that. Looking at the EUI reduction. So generally the principle here in design is to take the built environment, make it as efficient as possible to minimize the need for active systems in the first place. So you don't need as many solar panels if your building is built more efficiently. Next slide, please. And Vicky is the engineer here, so she can go into this in a little more detail, but just to introduce the concept of FIAS, this was kind of a design framework that we used, looking at the bottom of the pyramid first, going up to the top, so looking at passive strategies before we approach anything active. Next slide, please. So looking at all those charts and graphics are fun, but I think the design might be a little more fun, so we'll get into that. The existing building is a single-story cinder block structure on the corner of Mormon Avenue and 11th Street Northwest, and we looked at basically gut rehabbing the existing structure, and then adding a second story and roof deck on top of that. Next slide, please. So here you see a little axonometric diagram of what the end result might look like. Again, we're trying to create a monolithic structure so it doesn't look like it was cobbled together in pieces. Lots of sustainability features here. Next slide. So ultimately, if we do our job right, the building should fade into the background, right? We're not looking to be loud about it. We really want to celebrate the Hope Center and what they do. But a few of the key elements, as we mentioned before, we're looking at structural retrofit, we're looking at building envelope improvements, orienting windows in a way that we can allow for passive ventilation should the active system fail, if there's a long-term outage. And then once we've addressed that, we layer on the renewables, such as solar and geothermal. So they actually had a driveway that allowed for a good area for geothermal. All right, next slide, please. So as we face kind of new federal realities here, funding is less secure. So this project was vying for a very large grant, which they unfortunately did not get. So taking that into account, we look at how could we still achieve what they want to achieve over time in phases. So really looking at master planning and phasing at the building scale. So doing the most critical things first, the existing building footprint, their most important program, that comes first. Energy retrofits as we go, right? Structural improvements as we go so that we're ready for phase 2. We don't have to redo things. When they can amass the funds for the next phase, they can continue. And I'd say there's flexibility in phasing, but we just want to make sure that we're addressing the most critical items first for their operation. Looking at the construction, there's a few different tactics here, depending on whether or not zoning variances are required in your municipality to insulate outside of the building, should it be built up to your property line or setback. So a few different strategies illustrated here. We ended up proposing either or for A or B for the first floor, and then a new construction assembly above that, which stacked structurally with the below. Next slide, please. So looking at the floor plan really quick, because I am the architect on the call, I do want to talk a little bit about the program. So if you come into the main entry where it says vestibule, basically because of the vulnerable populations they serve, there were kind of two camps. There's the group of people that may need a new set of clothes, a shower, a place to cool down, and decompress, maybe do some laundry. That's the blue area. So once they've been able to do that, they can kind of reemerge and come into the main dining space, grab a meal, sit next to kids from the after school program or such. So it's a community mingling space with dignity. And then you'll see a kitchen in the middle. So that's a kitchen that's set between the multi-purpose space and the dining room, serving both. The multi-purpose room would serve as emergency shelter during extreme events. but also is a rentable space. So we're looking at resilience for the Hope Center day to day. If there's not an emergency, we also want the Hope Center to be set up for resilient operations. So they're able to rent out some spaces without disrupting their other operations. And then looking at the second floor, so if they're able to generate the funding and expand, there's kind of some bonus program here. So classroom spaces for continuing education or youth program or night school, and then some admin office spaces for Hope Center staff as they grow, as well as, of course, the necessary mechanical and support spaces for the renewables. The roof deck as kind of an optional third phase would be another rentable space, so another opportunity for them to further connect and deepen their roots in the community. Next slide. So this is all nice in theory, and this was a very theoretical schematic project, but I want to highlight a few examples of this in real life, in the wild, so to speak. Next slide, please. I think we're all familiar with the wildfires in California in 2024 that really ravaged a huge swath of LA. And this is just one example of a house that remains standing. It was a FIAS certified house, although FIAS itself is not necessarily why it's still standing. There were some material choices made, very strategic landscaping choices made that really set this building literally apart and let it survive. So, you know, we do have a critical role as designers when we are facing built projects in regions like this. And ultimately, the main takeaway I want you to take from this is the building that's still standing can continue to serve the community and address deeper social and economic inequalities. So this might have been a single family home, but if it's a community center, you can see how that might be even more impactful that it's still standing. Next slide, please. Looking at this in Chicago, an example here, this project during construction, after completion of the building envelope, but before the active mechanical systems were hooked up, experienced a 3-day power outage where we had close to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The building over those 3 days, just through the envelope alone, only dropped 2 degrees from 68 to 66. So this goes to show that FIAS slide is not to be taken lightly, right? These are principles that really matter. And you can see how the need for an active system is basically diminished just through key detailing and engaging trade partners and contractors early to make sure that this is constructed properly. Next slide, please. So as I say, $1 sign for installation now will save you $3 signs over the building lifetime, particularly during extreme events. Looking at another example in hurricane-prone region, really wanting to stress just material choices, where you place windows, right? And really making sure that we're designing with nature, not trying to put ourselves against her. She's very strong. Next slide, please. So kind of a segue into the next case study here. One building can be resilient, but a neighborhood of resilient buildings can be regenerative and far more impactful, allowing disadvantaged communities to recover that much faster. So our next case study is in Detroit, Michigan. So this is, Vicki and I will be tag team here for you. We both worked on this, was a network of resilience hubs, essentially. Next slide. So in the center of this matrix on the right, you'll see the dots representing where the resilience hubs are located. This is an existing network of hubs brought together by a nonprofit called the Eastside Community Network. So this is an existing network that we're looking to strengthen and uplift through strategic design intervention and kind of strategic allocation of funding. So there are 12 hubs in this network, already existing buildings, so all similar to the Hope Center in that we're retrofitting existing buildings, bringing the floor up essentially, and then seeing, okay, once we've addressed some baseline inequalities, what's left over and how can we equitably distribute those funds? Next slide. So we started with a gap analysis, looking at what environmental factors is this side of Detroit really facing. Extreme heat, a lot of power outages, and flooding. So those are the 3 kind of key environmental factors. Obviously, there's a lot of socioeconomic inequality here as well. Next slide. All right, so what we did for each of these hubs was we basically put together one of these sheets for each hub that looked at what funding is going where are the dollars going, and then generally what are like the extras So this is just a little graphic analysis, and Vicky's going to talk about this a little bit more. But if you'll go to the, I think, so this is the end of my portion. I'll end it off to Vicky, so she'll chat more about how funds were allocated for which purposes.
So just piggybacking from what Alina was talking about, we prioritize decarbonization, renewable energy, and wayfinding branding for all 12 hubs, right? As the basis of design that every hub should get, right? And then we built upon that, and beyond the baseline, we looked at very specific interventions each hub needed in an equitable way, right? That looked at allocating the leftover funding to address the specific needs of each individual hub. So this gets at looking at the network as a whole and making sure that it operates successfully for the neighborhood and for the city of Detroit. When you really zoom out and think about the East Side neighborhood in Detroit. So not every hub has to do everything. The goal was for them to complement each other as an interdependent system to create a sense of community. So with limited funds available, it was critical that we took into account what investments the hubs had already made into their infrastructure and programs. Therefore, the dollar value invested in each hub ends up varying greatly. As you can see on the table, Alina and I sat down and, zoomed out and thought about the budget, right? And then we said, okay, so thinking about the baseline that we originally discussed in 2 slides over, which is the decarbonization, renewables, and wayfinding, how do we prioritize what each hub needs dollar-wise, and then allocate the remaining initiatives to interior upgrades or like tents. This section of the city suffers from a lot of power outages. So one of the things that the neighborhood needed was generators. And you can see that the decarbonization fund for the ECN network is the largest, because the ECN network, as Alina illustrated, is the hub. It was the original hub, and it's the largest building. It's an old masonry building with like a lot of storefront, versus the Capuchin soup kitchen. So the soup kitchen is focused on providing food for the neighborhood during a disaster or an emergency. So this is a good slide to look at how we allocate the money across 12 buildings and still meet the bare requirements for resiliency, climate resiliency. And this will inform, the segue on how to implement, resiliency to like building infrastructure with budget constraints. And today we're going to be looking at the Martin Luther King Community Center and Health Center. So the question that I want to put on everybody's mind would be, what does design justice look like, right? So for the Racine's diverse Lincoln King neighborhood, it's a new community hub that honors the civil rights movement in Racine. The project targets net zero and LEED. So this project right now is currently in construction, and it's a catalyst for revival in the Racine's most deserving neighborhood. And this project, what it really does is it advances social justice by removing barriers to physical, mental, and emotional wellness. And it truly embodies, Dr. King's, vision of the beloved community. So this is a very good project for us to discuss as we move through the session. So with the MLK project, the climate hazards that this project faced were flooding, extreme heat, and severe storms. The project site is designed to minimize runoff from impervious surfaces to protect the downstream waters of the Ruth River and Lake Michigan. We implemented bioretention features that captures runoff water from the plaza areas and the basketball courts. And we also provide stormwater filtration and detention on this project. The sanitary wastewater from all fixtures is collected in a single 5,000-gallon cistern in the basement. And the heat that is extracted from this from the wastewater will be used to service the heat pumps. So what we're doing is we're collecting storm water that supplies 535 gallons of water daily to flush fixtures, and you call that gray water, and allows for up to 18, if there was a drought, this building can last for 18 days without outside source of water. That's how large the stormwater collection is. Now, 80% of the building's water use is supplied by precipitation. So it's kind of like a full cycle in terms of water usage. And for this project, we envisioned a new prototype for sustainability in the Racine neighborhood, as discussed earlier. The project is designed an energy model for net zero energy, for the net zero energy footprint. So its passive components include, a high performance envelope limited to only 30% glazing. It exceeds energy standards with highly efficient geothermal heat pump system with about 60 wells drilled at 500 feet deep under the parking lot. So for this project, we had the space to implement the geothermal, and we also have heat recovery embedded in our geothermal system wherever possible. So the heat pump water heating system is also, the building is also serviced with an 580 kilowatt PV array on the roof and the parking canopies, which offset more than 100% of the building's total annual energy use. And it's just very important for us to understand that this is like a holistic way of building a really large building with budget constraints and presenting it as a resilience hub for the Racine neighborhood. So this building is fully electric and grid integration ready. The project does not use any fossil fuels. So now commissioning, retro commissioning, and continuous monitoring of water and energy use is anticipated upon completion of this project. So we want to talk about PM 2.5, which is kind of like a segue from our discussion with heat. Let's talk about particles, right? So the importance of stating that this project has no on-site burning fossil fuels is related to PM 2.5, right? So what is PM 2.5? PM 2.5 is fine particulate matter in air pollution, and it's harmful to human health, and it's responsible for 85,000 to 200,000 deaths in the United States. So people of color more broadly, including Black and Hispanic people and Asian Americans, are exposed to more pollution from nearly every source. So likely for the same geographic reason, white Americans were slightly more exposed to particulate pollution from agriculture, included from, soil tilling and wind erosion. But in California, which produces more than a third of the country's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts, Hispanic people were disproportionately exposed more than the white Americans. So getting a clearer picture of how different sources of air pollution affect different groups of people is very important as designers, because the history has shown that simply reducing overall emissions doesn't just address, racial and other disparities when we just think about it, right, in terms of reduction of fossil fuels. Now, bringing that segue back into the loop of geothermal, the first graph shows the typical heat rejection using a VRF heat pump technology, which still uses the grid, right, which supplied electricity, which has some component of fossil fuel, right? If we piggyback to the education we just had about PM 2.5. But when we adapt to the geothermal technology, we take the heat that we reject in the summer months, which is the center of this graph, and pull it out into the winter, right? So all of a sudden, we don't have any red left, correct? So now we're going into the third part of the graph, where we are not burning any on-site fossil fuel, which is the bottom part of the slide. So let's bring this back to money, because a lot of designers are stifled because of budget constraints, right? So let's kind of loop this into how we implement resilient building infrastructures. The step one is to think about all the components that we need. And here's just a step-by-step process of thinking about how we think about the critical structure, identify the site. So if we're thinking about geothermal, we have to put site into factor, right? And then we integrate sustainability, we leverage modular construction where we can, if we have schedule constraints, and then we secure funding and implementation, and then think about, how we think about this with budget constraints would be to divvy up the money into the different buckets of how we will spend it and what that truly means to our building systems, our interior finishing, our exterior work, our foundation and structural work. And we always need to create like a contingency plan, because for Alina and I, when we kind of allocated the budget for the different hubs that we worked on, we had to think about facility management post-completion of the project. So I'd like to kind of segue into when you're faced with budget constraints, you start thinking about how to save, right? And that kind of ties into the energy tax credit, which helps you save money on your taxes when you make a climate resilient hub more energy efficient. So think about the solar panels, the better insulation, the energy saving windows. If you invest these, the government gives you dollar for dollar reduction on your tax bill. So the question becomes, who is eligible for energy tax credit? So these are the options that we have. And the deal is elective pay or direct pay. So normally tax credits only help if you owe taxes, but if you're a school, nonprofit, or local government that doesn't pay taxes, what are you going to do? So that's where the elective pay or direct pay comes in. It lets these group of people get cash refund instead of tax credits, right? Even if they owe zero in taxes. So that's very important, as for every kind of designer or whoever your client is, it's important to discuss, okay, energy tax credits especially when you have budget constraints. So now more organizations can benefit from clean energy upgrades like solar panels and heat pumps, which now enters into the Inflation Reduction Act funding, which refers to money allocated through the IRA. So the United States passed a law in 2022 to tackle climate change, where there's like, okay, we have lower energy costs to promote clean energy. Here's a simple breakdown for our presentation. So let's say on the Racine project, we utilized solar panels, geothermal back in 2022. And here's an example of how much the IRA has funded since 2022. The IRA has funded over $270 billion in tax credits and $61 billion in grants so far to support clean energy, energy efficient homes and buildings, electric vehicles and charging stations, climate resilient infrastructure. And they also bring this back to our topic of climate justice, right? Where we're supporting low income and disadvantaged communities to help families and businesses save money, cut pollution, and build a more sustainable future. So the bottom line for the Racine project was the numbers that you see on the screen. Obviously, this is 2 years ago, before the IRA was updated recently. So one thing I would like to know as an update from the time we're in right now is we can still utilize these tax credits. On the MLK Center, we were able to utilize and save money on solar PVs, geo wells, and, to convince our client, okay, this is how much we would have spent originally if we used the all-electric heat pumps. And this is your bottom line if we utilize the energy tax credits to promote the geothermal system. But in 2025, the IRA kind of updated the tax credits for geothermal specifically, which we still have the 30% tax credit, right, for homeowners, right, for Energy Star rated geothermal heat pumps. And this applies to systems placed in service until January 1st of 2033. And then there will be a phase out schedule, right? The credit will gradually decrease from 30% to 26% from 2033 to 2034. And it would go all the way down to 22% in 2034. So we already discussed who is eligible, and the difference here is the bonus for low income households would be additional assistance may be available through programs like DOE's weatherization assistance program and low income home energy assistance programs. So what does the Resilience Hub provide, Alina?
So as we talk about all of this, I think it's important to realize the confluence of socioeconomic and building infrastructure and then financial requirements, right? So we're really placing resilience at the intersection of those things. The goal is to create more resilient communities. We know that, climate change isn't going away. We can shut our eyes, it's still going to happen. So how can we respond? And what control do we have as design professionals or, developers, real estate folks, whoever we are on the call today, right? What ownership do you have in this process? And how can you prioritize, leverage, whatever funding mechanisms are out there? How can we prioritize and leverage those to make sure that we're building the most resilient buildings and infrastructure and community centers possible? So I think
that's what we're basically, I guess that's the gist of today's topic. So resilience hubs help communities to plan for increasing frequency of extreme weather, right? So for example, recent extreme events in California, wildfires, North Carolina and Florida hurricanes, and Arizona heat waves. I know I worked on, with Alina, I'm sure there's a Montana project that we worked on for the resilience hubs for schools. And then the next one will be they help communities promote economic growth, stability, and revitalization. So we want to advocate for neighborhood infrastructure and connect residents with like training and employment opportunities. And then finally, they improve community connections, right? And access to resources. Now that I've moved to Detroit, I can truly understand what that really meant with the East Side Community Network, where you really need a hub to run to when you're facing flooding and when there is no power, and there are people that are hooked up on, life ventilators in their homes and there is no power, they need a place to run to. And then we bring all of this and we talk about the biggest limitation of it all, and the biggest limitation of it all is funding. And federal funding plays a crucial role, right, in supporting many of our projects, given the complexities of the current landscape we've been exploring ways to navigate these challenges while continuing to serve our clients under the new administration. The first step is understanding the administration's priorities and identifying how key aspects of your project align with them. So when you're crafting an application for federal funding, right, it's essential to frame your proposal in a way that clearly connects your project to the administration's focus areas, right? Because you want to create a win-win for yourself. So while equity and environmental justice may not be central to this administration's agenda, we need to strategically align ourselves, and our projects with its priorities, if that makes sense, so that it's a vital approach to adapting our projects in this evolving times. So securing federal funding allows you to drive meaningful change, right, by advancing equity and climate justice at the local level. While national priorities may shift, these resources can be leveraged to create tangible impacts, ensuring communities have access to sustainable infrastructure, inclusive opportunities. So we want to make sure that, from Alina and I talking in the past, almost 30 to 35 minutes, we want to make sure that if the key takeaway from this presentation is that we're aligning our projects with available funding as best as we can in the climate that we're in. Thank you. So I'm going to pass it over to Liz to kind of guide the question section.
Thank you. And thank you both, Victoria and Elena. This was really, really great. We already have some questions that are coming in through the chat, but feel free to put any other ones into the question and answer box, and I can facilitate those for you all. So just some of the first questions that we got. You talked some about historical distrust in government or other areas of authority in communities like Northwest Roanoke. What strategies have you seen that have proven to be effective in building trust and ensuring long-term engagement with these resilience hubs once they're up and running?
I can take that one. Yeah, so I think in Roanoke in particular, we noticed that distrust was really tangible when we were visiting the site and speaking with folks there. So I'd say, part of it is certainly managing how we approach the project and making sure that we're not coming in with survivor complex and trying to tell them what to do, but really to focus on our role as designers to listen and respond to what we're hearing. So that's a really important part, right, in the role that we play. And I think additionally, it's about looking at the synergies that do exist. So what are City Hall's priorities, right? If we're talking about like federal priorities, take it down to the local level. What are City Hall's priorities? What do they want to do right now? What political pressure are they facing? Where is there room to negotiate or maneuver in the sense of aligning, as Vicky was saying, your goals to achieve what it is you want to achieve, whether or not, this is a long-term partnership. So I think there's some strategy involved there. And we as kind of neutral third parties often are better, not better, but we're positioned in a way where we can kind of neutrally help to navigate those situations, potentially creating bridges and allowing communities to get to the end goal, right? Because we know that if they just achieve the goal, if they build that resilience hub, the community will be better off for it.
Absolutely. And sort of a follow-up to that, how can we measure or evaluate the success of this community engagement over time, especially with some of these historically disinvested neighborhoods? So how can we determine what success looks like long-term with a resilience hub?
I'd say with the Hope Center, they were partnered with Virginia Tech. So Virginia Tech was helping them put together this grant application for the Inflation Reduction Act. And that was a crucial partner because they were local, they were non-government, but it's a trusted institution and they have funding behind the research. So that, they're well positioned to continue the work once the design is done and the architect and the engineers are all gone. There's someone there to continue that work. So I think identifying those key partners early and getting them on board, even pre-design can be helpful in laying the groundwork. And I know that for Virginia Tech, for example, they even had exercises helping the client and the community kind of sort through like, what do we want to have here? What's important to us? So there's ongoing opportunities always to integrate partners like that.
And then just to piggyback what Alina was talking about, in the budget too, we have money allocated for staff members that are going to be, when we talked about the budget constraints and the different levels that we're splitting that money, in a lot of the resilience hubs that we designed and we proposed for, it was $20 million, right? And it was important that we allocated money to people that will make sure, at least for the first 3 years upon opening the Resilience Hub, there's staff members that making sure that the building is functioning how it's supposed to be. We're implementing monitoring systems for our mechanical systems, especially in hubs that had very huge need for HVAC upgrades, to just give you the other side of how we would do it from an engineering perspective.
Absolutely. Could you talk some about historic preservation of places and buildings, and was that a consideration that you had for any of these projects you're working on?
Adaptive reuse.
Mhm. I think none of these particular projects that were existing were landmarked. But for sure, it's a huge part of Farr Associates' portfolio to work with the building that exists always first, right? The most sustainable building is the one that's already there. So I think whether or not it's landmarked, there is benefit to reusing structure. If it is landmarked, I think that also is another funding opportunity, you know, a difference for tax credits.
Right.
And I think that's also something the state is really trying to promote. So where federal funding might be dropping off, there's also local and state funding that's trying to fill the gap and bridge that divide so that these projects can continue.
And
To do that kind of
yeah, and then just to also follow that thought process, there is when we do have historic developments in the past, I faced like, you know, the community trying to talk about the facade, and there are ways that engineers and designers can build from the outside. So where you're maintaining those old windows, there's still a stop gap in still promoting your double pane windows and your insulation from the inside, even if you're maintaining the old glory of the building. So there are ways around using adaptive reuse and historical landmark projects to promote resilience designs as you just have to think outside the box sometimes and fight a little bit more than you would typically do. You can't just say, oh, okay, I went to the zoning review for this historic landmark and they want me to keep all the existing windows, so we will keep all the existing windows and waste energy. No, you can keep all the existing windows and still improve thermal insulation from the inside. There are specialists that work on those, might also affect your budget. So that's something that you can look into.
Absolutely. And in that sort of same line of thought around advocating for these types of changes, who would you say, from your experience, has been the best position to create or advocate for these resilience hubs? Is it the architecture and engineering teams that are coming in? Sort of what has been your experience on that?
We have to pick one person.
I think we all play a role, definitely. I would say like having if it's a, you know, real estate developer, having a real estate developer that cares and, you know, has a certain set of values that they're promoting through their portfolio of work, that matters. An architect and engineering team advocating for, you know, the best sustainable building practices that are, you know, prioritizing how you spend money so that you save money later or have a better project long term, right? All of those are considerations. So I'd say like no one's off the hook. We all have
Well,
a part to
I
play.
think if we zoom out, like let's just take 2 steps back to the question and really truly understand that question because it's a tricky one. So there is the portion of, you know, implementing resilience design to like when you have a client that has the money and comes to you as the architect or engineer or the team member working for this client, right? Under that umbrella, to be completely honest, it's very important if the person who holds the money cares about the climate, because then it makes your arguments like a lot easier. And then in the umbrella where like what Alina and I worked on, we worked for communities. So these communities were already passionate about it. So we're not selling them the script or we're just informing how to allocate that money, right? So there's different umbrellas on how you think about who the key stakeholder is to, you know, implementing the resilient design. And the other thing I want to take note of as a mechanical engineer is it's very important that we're bringing engineering at the beginning of these conversations, even before we get to schematic design, because there is something to be said about, okay, a lot of people throw out the buzzword of, we're just going to put in geothermal because they think it's great. But then you need an expert in the room that would champion that particular resilience, right? And then the architect would champion the insulation, and then everybody kind of takes in what their expertise is and champions it. And then when we're all seated on that round table, we're all just championing the design together, as opposed to not bringing in the engineer before you allocate the budget. And then now we're fighting backwards instead of forward.
So this wasn't the question, but I do want to add, having an integrated design process is really important, and engaging key stakeholders early is super important. So if you are an architect, I know that often that is our, job. We decide when we bring in the engineering team, so please bring them in right away. Work with your friends. Vicky, we've been at roundtables and integrated design workshops, and you're throwing ideas around. I don't know everything she knows. Like, I'm gonna just say, I know some things, but having your engineers at the table early, it benefits everybody.
Absolutely. And one sort of follow-up question that just came in is around sort of the proposal process. And do you have a process that you follow to involve the community and get their feedback like throughout that proposal process? Could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
Who wants to go first, Alina?
I can take a stab at it. I think so generally community-oriented projects want to have a robust community engagement process. There's many ways to
Right.
do that, I think, with varying degrees of success. Again, I think it comes down to who your partners are. So if the client is doing a private building, but wants to engage the community, who are the local community, the trusted local community partners that already have an established network and rapport in the community that can help, if you sell them your idea, they can help sell it further. And they can also set up robust engagement sessions where you're interacting with the community in a way that a lot of them have a chance to know what's going on in their neighborhood before they turn around and say, like, who
And
agreed
see,
to that?
yeah, what you're building. Yeah, yeah. So
Mhm.
the other thing too is there's also like a part of this question that I'm now thinking like, do we also talk about fundraising? Because then when you say proposal, is this a proposal of we already have the money and we want to engage the community to discuss what the community needs? So we're not like blindsided in the corner in our offices thinking that we're providing what the community needs without engaging the community. So that's different from fundraising, and that's also different from that caveat of resilience hubs that we worked on in 2024. So in 2024, when we were informing the budget from the federal government, what we did in the proposal stage of telling the federal government that this is how we will allocate $20 million in this disadvantaged neighborhood, what we did was actually engage the community in like a physical. So Alina flew to Detroit for the ECN network, and it was like a workshop, and she had renderings, and we took polls, and we took surveys, and we truly engaged the community. Come to this certain location. There was news about it prior to us showing up, all the designers, the architects, and the engineers. And these are people actually coming physically to write down what they need. So yes, that can be done just depending on the client or the purpose of the project in terms of community engagement.
Absolutely. We've gotten a few questions about materials and material choices. Could you talk some more about sort of how you can select structural materials for specific design purposes? So if you're trying to combat fire or hurricane impacts for your resilience hub, and what kind of material choices you might be thinking about in those considerations.
Sure. I think that to me, there's always a balance of like, carbon footprint and structural performance. And though I'm not a structural engineer, I'll try to kind of speak the architect's version of it, which is, there's a certain aesthetic to different systems that is also obviously part of your consideration. There's budgetary considerations. So I would say just listing out all of your viable options and then, putting a weight on it. What's the carbon footprint? What's the aesthetic? What code implications does it have, depending on how flammable it is, et cetera. And then, make your choice. And I would also say the best projects probably also don't answer all the questions right away. There are your key stakeholders, and it can be a discussion about what system is best for this project for these reasons, right? So again, engaging your key stakeholders to make those big moves early on is helpful in aligning priorities and making sure you're on the same page as you get down into the weeds.
I guess, Alina, I want to ask a question. Are there resources then, I guess, as a subtext of the question,
Yeah.
are there
Um,
resources? Let's say you're an
mhm.
architect and you don't know where to go. You're building this and you want to think at the small minimum
Mhm.
level on how to implement resilience design. Because I feel like we talked about and learned about this in Portland, where there's resources, right? To get like,
Yeah. We have some resources on carbon footprint, for example. So there are online carbon calculators that you can pretty easily see, what's the environmental impact of the structural system. And that's often one of the biggest decisions you can make in terms of the environmental impact and the embodied carbon of your building. So LBC is definitely a good hub. They have multiple different versions of the calculator and spreadsheet form, or even Revit plugins that you can use. Um, and then I'd say the code itself, obviously just understanding the code and the implications of using timber versus concrete and steel versus wood frame construction, as it pertains to the height of your building, et cetera. And then I'd say if you have a contractor engaged or some kind of pricing consultant, they can also help you in that vein figure out, can we afford, option A, B, or C?
right?
One other question sort of about your design choices. Could you talk about tree shading at all? Is that a consideration that you
Yeah.
had for any of the properties? So the inquirer asks if you could share more about trees for east, south, and west sides of the building envelope in contrast to architecture not blocking the building facade, so often void of robust tree plantings or vines trellised on them.
I mean, obviously it
That's a
depends
very
on
good
your
question.
site. It's a very good
Yeah.
question. I think the Hope Center had a driveway to the south, so we were able to provide some planters with deciduous trees that would provide shading during this natural shading during the summer and allow light through in the winter. Where the site allows, obviously it kind of depends on the context, but utilizing deciduous trees on the south, if you have strong winds coming from a certain direction, having a row of evergreen trees can be helpful in blocking that and keeping the building from absorbing a lot of that, losing a lot of heat um, to the wind. So I'd say as much as you can also work with the surrounding context, the better, right? That's just one of the many passive strategies you can use and absolutely should totally dive into the weeds on,
Yeah.
because
So like, yeah,
you
I
don't have
agree
the
with
energy
you,
to spend in
Alina.
the first place.
Because like there was one of the projects that we worked on in 2024 that wasn't highlighted in this presentation, which is the Montana schools. Tree shading was such a huge topic because when you're building the schools, you want the kids to play on the playgrounds, but then you have all these surfaces on the playgrounds when it's really hot in extreme heat that doesn't even let the kids to play on the playground. So it's like, how do you plant trees in a strategic way that allows the kids play, right? And then also shield the building to influence, the building's energy use and also allow daylighting. It's like there's just multiple. It's such a good question because in one of the projects that we had in 2024, tree shading was a very large topic for some reason because it's like, do we place the trees here because it reduces X amount of energy through shading, or it helps, but then it costs this much? Do we want to put in that money on double glazed windows instead? So tree shading, as simple as it sounds, can be like an elaborate conversation. And I hope that when people are thinking about it, they're able to just like itemize the design factors and make a decision based on which section of the building they plant trees.
Everyone, thank you so much for sharing with our audience. Speakers, Alina, Victoria, thank you so much. Liz, thank you for moderating. Attendees, thank you for coming. I want to just once again mention the links that you'll find in the chat. We have a feedback survey we'd love to have you fill out. I'll put that at the bottom again really quickly. We also have the link for AIA reporting. Make sure to click that now if you need it. And again, thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of your day. We'll be sending a follow-up next week, and you will get a recording of this and the PDF of the slides. So thank you all again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank
Bye.
you. Take care.